Hi everyone, my name is Tim Bauma. I'm a senior analyst. I work for the Government of Canada, and I'm going to give you an overview of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. I have a consultation deck here of some of the latest work that we've done, and I will present it, walk through the material, and give you an idea of what we're working on. So just to give you a bit of context, again, my name is Tim Bauma. I've been working on digital identity for a number of years now, and we've been working on not only the federal policy instruments for the Government of Canada, namely the Directive on Identity Management along with guidelines. We've also been working with the provinces and the territories to come up with what we've been calling a pan-Canadian approach. This has been in progress for the last, better part of a decade, if not more than a decade. And the latest rendition that we've been working on is the trust framework. And really, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is to trust digital identities across jurisdictions. So if you have a trusted digital identity that comes from a province, we can actually accept it in a federal program. And the great benefit of this is that enabling citizens or residents of a province to actually do the identity proofing once, the registration once, do the authentication once, and then immediately access a federal program. So with that, I will start the presentation. I will go into presentation mode, and I will see you on the other side. There we go. So this is the latest slide deck. I had done one a few days earlier, and we've refined it a bit, so I've decided to redo the webinar. So this is the take 2 of the webinar. So what are we trying to do with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework? We're trying to create a very simple and integrative framework that is easy to understand, yet capable of being applied in a complex environment. We've discovered, like over the years, a lot of the guidance, a lot of the guidelines, a lot of the methodologies work very well within a specific context, within an operational context. But there's a lot of confusion or need for clarification when you have multiple actors involved. And when I say multiple actors, I'm speaking of different jurisdictions that might be collaborating or relying on each other, having private sector partners or service providers, and also coming up with an approach that can work across a variety of service contexts. So what we're trying to do is come up with a framework that can actually work across those contexts. Number 2, we want it to be technology agnostic. We recognize that technology changes very, very quickly, and we want to have a framework that works for the future. It provides flexibility and, more importantly, logical precision in assessing the trustworthiness of digital identity solutions and digital identity providers. Again, there's lots of great stuff, lots of innovation out there, but we really want to understand what exactly it's doing, how we can rely on it, and how it can fit into a larger picture. You know, you got biometrics, you have new decentralized solutions, you have token service provider networks, you have identity proofing methodologies, you have facial recognition, taking all of that and actually bringing that into a framework so that we can actually situate and understand the solutions and enable them to realize what we call a trusted digital identity. The third one is the ability to complement existing frameworks. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. There are existing security frameworks, security assessment and authorization, privacy impact assessments, service delivery frameworks. We want to leverage those. We don't want to reinvent those. And as we develop the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, we realize that the key centerpiece is really the confidence in the processes or the integrity of the processes, which we call trusted processes. That's what we need to focus on, and then we can add on this on the other frameworks. We also want to have a framework that provides clear links to applicable policy, regulation, and legislative frameworks. Again, in Canada, the context that we have with the federal government, with the provinces and territories, we have different legislation, not necessarily consistent, but what we want to do is actually provide a set of conformance criteria that can actually map to legislation fairly easily, or regulatory regimes when they come into place. Fifth, we want to normalize or standardize key processes and capabilities related to digital identity. We want to do this so that we can actually benchmark and enable not only cross-sector collaboration, when I say cross-sector, across different sectors of the economy, different jurisdictions, and we also want to enable and not constrain ecosystem development. We're certainly witnessing a flourishing of innovative solutions and approaches. We want that to continue, but we want to have a solid framework so we can actually situate these technologies, solutions, and services. Getting into the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, what we discovered, like we first started out with digital identity or trusted digital identity, and we realized that we had to bring the abstraction up a level, so to speak, and we actually have started to talk about what we're calling trusted digital representations, and those are digital things that have rights and obligations and duties associated with them. The first and most obvious is a trusted digital identity relating to an individual, but we're also starting to define trusted digital identities as they relate to organizations or businesses, and we see this extending to trusted digital identities that might relate to devices and to processes. We're not there yet, but we recognize that we need to bring these under the umbrella of trusted digital representations. We also have formalized this notion of a trusted process. What I talked about earlier is defining very precisely and concisely the key processes that we need to have confidence in. And currently, we have defined 3 trusted digital representations, 24 atomic trusted processes, and what we discovered that these atomic processes can be grouped together to form various compound trusted processes such as identity assurance, credential assurance, and notification and consent. We want to make sure that the trust framework is extensible and interoperable. I'm sure we haven't thought of every single trusted process that's out there. Again, we have 24, but there may be more as we continue to analyze the domain or the domains that we need to work within. And also we're looking for additional or extensible interoperability, namely to map to some of these emerging standards or schemes, for example, vectors of trust. We are already mapping to levels of assurance, but we're seeing a lot of opportunity around vectors of trust as well. So before we get into the details of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, I just want to talk briefly about foundational identity versus functional identity. What's been very clear working in the public sector, at the federal level, and the provincial and territorial level, the governments have a role in creating what we call the foundational identity. That's the fact that you actually exist in the first place. Typically, it's through a vital statistics event, namely a birth, which is registered with the Vital Statistics Registrar, or if you come into the country to become a permanent resident and eventually a citizen, that is taken care of by immigration. In our context, it's Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. And those are foundational events, and that produces your foundational identity, which in turn provides a foundational evidence of identity. That may be a permanent resident card, a birth certificate. The key thing here is that can underlie the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And the analogy that I give is where the public sector plays a role is not that dissimilar to what the Bank of Canada does within Canada. The Bank of Canada is an institution that's responsible for issuing the currency, the Canadian dollar. It manages the money supply. It has the dollar as the denomination. And it actually lends that money out to the chartered banks and the financial institutions, who in turn actually take that money and actually run the economy. They use it to lend out, they use it for savings, etc., and they basically run the economy. But at the end of the day, it is underwritten by the Canadian dollar, which is standardized. So the key thing here, perhaps it's not a direct parallel, but it is actually a useful analogy, is that foundational identity underlies the trust framework, especially for high-value services or identity-dependent services, such as applying for a passport, applying for social benefits, receiving social benefits. The other key thing here is that the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework can work without foundational identity. There's no reason why a community, a sector, can use the trust framework and apply it in their own context and risk manage it such. And another parallel there is like rewards points, for example, Aeroplan or Air Miles. Again, you could argue that's a private currency. It's not backstopped by the Canadian dollar. It has its own ecosystem. It has its own relying parties that recognize and trade in those points, but it's not underwritten by the Canadian dollar. Even though it can be redeemed for such or equivalent services, it doesn't necessarily have to rely on it. And again, with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, there's no reason that if you have a very specific case for functional identity and you don't have the need for foundational identity, you can actually apply the framework. As I talked about earlier, we defined 3 trusted digital representations. And this is a concept that we are starting to develop at a higher level. And as I said, we have the notion of a trusted digital identity, which relates to a person or a natural person. Then we have a trusted digital identity that relates to an organization. And then finally, a verified relationship, which is really an association between either a person or 2 persons, or a person and organization, or between organizations. The key thing here is that these high-level trusted digital representations are, again, there's some legality associated with it, with them. There are rights, duties, or obligations. There's some accountability. And when you're getting into high-value transactions, you're going to need some sort of legal basis or legal force, and this gives you the ability to map that to these higher level representations. Before we get into the detail, I just want to talk about the trusted process model. When we did the analysis, we found that this was a key building block, the trusted process. And a trusted process is an activity or set of activities that results in a state transition in an object that can be relied on by other trusted processes. You have an object input state, you have a trusted process that enables a state transition. The conformance criteria down here, which we are defining, actually govern or determine the criteria that's necessary for that state transition, and that provides or yields an output state. And that output state can be relied on as a quote-unquote proof or a verifiable claim by others downstream. And so really the heavy lifting of the trust framework is really formalizing and standardizing these trusted processes, the input states, the output states, and the conformance criteria. That's the essence of defining the trust framework. So, as I said, we have defined 24 atomic trusted processes. If you're familiar with the work that we've been doing with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, a lot of these aren't new. Again, I'll go through 3 examples of what a trusted process is, but here are the key ones, like identity resolution, for example, identity establishment, credential issuance, credential authentication, credential suspension. Then we get into more of the notification, requesting consent, persisting consent, etc. So here are some examples of atomic trusted processes. The first one is identity validation, which is the state transition from unconfirmed identity information to confirmed identity information. What that is practically speaking, and we see these in these business processes, is confirming your name and date of birth. You may present it to an organization, and what they actually have to do is take your information, and they actually have to validate or confirm an against authoritative record. Depending on the context, it may be it might be confirmed against a vital statistics register. It can be confirmed against a driver's license database. It can be confirmed against the social insurance register. But at the end of the day, it's taking unconfirmed identity information that you've expressed yourself. It's gone through an identity validation process, and it actually has been confirmed. So your identity information is confirmed. Credential authentication. You may have a username and password, you may have a smart card, you may have a chip and PIN, you may have a smartphone that's been issued to you, but you need to authenticate yourself or authenticate that you actually have control over it, and that becomes an authenticated credential. Similarly, in relating to notification consent, you may have provided one-time consent for something, and you want to have that consent to be valid for a certain period of time, like 6 months or a year or so. So there's a trusted process that takes your one-time consent, and of course with your consent actually transitions that to an ongoing consent. So these are, it gives you an example of the trusted processes, the building blocks. So here we go. Where, as I said earlier, we've mapped it to identity assurance, credential assurance, and notification and consent. Here's the identity assurance compound trusted process, and what we've discovered, as I talked about earlier, is that a lot of the business processes, a lot of the higher level concepts actually can be decomposed into these atomic processes. So identity assurance, very quickly going through them, there's an identity resolution process to make sure that you've got unique identity information. Identity establishment is creating an authoritative record. Identity validation is confirming your identity information. We talked about that on the previous slide. Identity verification is making sure that it's you presenting your own information, not someone else. That's basically attributing the identity information to you. Identity maintenance is making sure that we have the latest and greatest information about you. That can be done through back-end systems. It can be done through front-end systems. Liveness and fraud detection, ensuring that if there's any fraud associated, or making sure that you are actually a live person presenting yourself. That's another trusted process. Then we have these other two. They're kind of special processes, and we decided to put them into the identity assurance compound process. There's the identity credential binding, which is once I've proven who you are, I need to associate that with your username and password, or I need to associate that with your smart card. I may need to associate that with your FIDO key, for example. So we call that identity credential binding. And then we have identity linking. They look very similar, but they aren't. Identity linking is being able to associate identifiers across different contexts. So for example, I come in from a province, I have a unique identifier from the province, and it needs to be associated with another unique identifier that I have within a federal program, for example, and those things have to be mapped or linked together, and that's what we've called is identity linking. So really, at the high level, what we're doing is that we're taking evidence of identity and we're turning it into proof of identity. You can view those as the major state transitions that are the compound of the output states there that we have in the identity assurance box. Credential assurance, same thing. This is really related to like the authentication, making sure that what's been issued to is under your control. These processes, if you're in the trade, are very familiar: credential issuance, credential authentication, credential suspension, credential recovery, credential maintenance, credential revocation, authentication session initiation, authentication session termination. That really relates to creating that secure communication channel once we know, or once the system knows that you have something under your control. And really the large high-level state transition here is going from an unknown actor, someone that's completely untracked, don't know from one interaction to the other if it can be attributed to the same entity, and we can transition that to an authenticated user. Finally, notification and consent is the third high-level compound process or bucket. And this is really formalizing the whole notification and consent process to make sure that the proper consent for the use and disclosure of your information has been carried out properly. And again, we have these trusted processes to validate authorization for consent, formulate notification requirements, request consent, persist consent, consent maintenance, review consent, and consent notification. And really at the high level is that you're taking an implicit consent. We first were calling this no consent, but we decided to call it implicit consent because oftentimes when you're interacting with a service, there is some sort of consent implied, and that's okay. But really, we want to transition to the point where we actually have the individual's active and informed consent. Lots of discussion about how this will be defined, but this is the first set of trusted processes that we have for notification and consent. So coming back to trusted digital identity of a person, as I said, this is one of the trusted digital representations that we've defined quite well. It is really the set of trusted processes that come from identity assurance, credential assurance, and notification and consent. That's what we have to trust coming in from a jurisdiction or coming in from a private sector trusted digital identity provider. We have to make sure that those processes, that we have confidence in those processes. The other thing here you see at the bottom is the trusted supporting infrastructure, and you'll see the details on a later slide. Not only do we need to trust the integrity of those processes, we need to trust the conveyance of the outputs going through, whether it is a traditional SAML integration or OpenID Connect, or through a token service provider network, or even verifiable credentials through a decentralized network. We have to make sure that we can trust the infrastructure, not only to ensure that the claims haven't changed or they haven't been modified, like a man-in-the-middle attack, but like all the security and privacy are honored as well. So coming back to what is a trusted digital identity, again, this is a very useful way of conceptualizing it in a way that doesn't necessarily constrain the trusted digital identity providers to take a particular approach. A trusted digital identity can be conceptualized as a set of trusted process outputs or proofs that are independent of the conveyance method. And depending on the ecosystem, some of these trusted processes may be carried out by multiple parties at different points in time. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we've reviewed pretty much the majority of guidance in this space, not only our own guidance from other jurisdictions, the stuff that's been published by NIST, from the European Union, from the UK, all great stuff, but what we discovered that typically the guidance was written for a particular context, for within a single program or within a single jurisdiction, and it works fine, but we needed to come up with a way to enable trusted processes to be relied across different contexts, meaning different jurisdictions. And I'd say the other key thing that we needed to really clarify is that a trusted digital identity is an end product, but it may be produced by, or the supply chain may be a series of actors or providers that have provided key services that have happened over a different or over different points in time. And we'll show that in an example a little bit later on. Just coming back to the trusted supporting infrastructure, the key point here is that we're not reinventing the wheel. We are focusing the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework on ensuring the integrity of processes relating to trusted digital identity, and then leveraging all of those other frameworks, methodologies that relate to digital service delivery, privacy and security, audit and logging, federation interoperability. These are the technical standards. Any existing governance or endorsement structures that are out there, and anything related to service authorization and access. So really, at the end of the day, the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and its assessment is just another tool in the assessment box to make sure that we can actually provide services with confidence to Canadians. Just coming back to other compound trusted processes, what we discovered is that in the guidance or existing guidance, there's a lot of, maybe the term is an inconsistency. There are different different ways of defining the business processes and different different scopes of these business processes, and this is just some of the examples that we've come across: identity creation, credential creation, identity confirmation, binding, notification, consent. At the bottom here, trusted digital identity creation, service enrollment. And when we looked at these trusted processes, these higher level trusted processes, which are typically business processes within a program, we found that we could actually decompose them into those 24 atomic trusted processes that we've defined, and we show that on the next slide. So here's an example of what we had originally called identity confirmation, confirming that you are the right person. We discovered it was a really, there were 4 atomic processes there. Identity validation, confirming your information that you've provided against an authoritative record. That's like usually a classic validation lookup. Oftentimes there may be an identity maintenance process to make sure that that we do have the latest and greatest information about you on record. That may be done in the background, it may be done in advance. Then there's liveness and fraud detection. Again, this is to really counter all those different types of fraud, that it might be a robot or someone, an imposter, or there may be fraud flags associated with, it could be with the devices that you're using, the endpoints that you're using. Really, we found that we needed to have that trusted process there as well. And then finally, identity verification, which is different from identity validation. Identity verification is making sure that you are the one claiming your own information. And there's different ways of doing it. You can do out-of-band challenges, you can do out-of-band text messaging, you can do mail-out codes, etc. You can do shared secrets, whole bunch of different processes, and that's really to make sure that you are the one providing the information. As I said earlier, trusted processes can be carried out by multiple parties. And in this example here, a provincial or territorial trusted digital identity is being consumed by a federal service. We laid out the 24 trusted processes in an example, or in a pilot project that we're working on right now. We've mapped out the levels of assurance that we're expecting. And again, this is coming in from a province or territory. We've actually laid out which trusted processes are carried out by the trusted digital identity provider. And you see the trusted digital identity provider does the majority of them. What we discovered when it's consumed by a relying party, a federal program, we discovered that some of these trusted processes were being carried out again. But what was interesting, these processes were being carried out for the requirements of their specific context. So I'll just drill down on a couple of these. For example, identity resolution. The province or territory has to make sure that they can uniquely identify the individual within their population. So typically they generate a number or assign a number. Within a federal program, they typically have a population that spans across multiple jurisdictions, or the entire country for that matter. They have a completely different population. They have a completely different identifier, for example, the social insurance number, and they have to make sure that they can map to one and only one person. And really, what we're saying here is that the trusted digital identity provider has to be able to uniquely resolve to one individual. The relying party has to uniquely resolve to one and only one individual. That has to be the same individual. And then when they do the identity linking, tying those identifiers together, they have to make sure that it's actually mapping to the same individual. We also discovered that oftentimes that a federal program may be wanting to consume a trusted digital identity, but they may want to top up some of the controls just to risk manage for their own context. They may do additional identity verification, additional identity maintenance. They may do some further liveness and fraud detection. Key thing here is that we are really clarifying what is being consumed, what is being relied on, and then the relying party can actually decide whether to accept it at face value. And this example here, you notice the relying party is not doing any identity validation because they know that the province has already confirmed that information about that individual, so there's no need to go check it anymore because they know that they have the latest and greatest. You'll see this column in the center, the credential service provider. It's empty in this example. We do have authentication providers that provide us with authentication services with no identity associated with it. They just provide us with a what we call a persistent anonymous identifier. If we get this scheme working, well, it is working, with the accepting the trusted digital identity from the province, we no longer need those authentication services because they've already been authenticated within the province. They've already been identity proofed, or their identity assurance has already been bound, and then the relying party can simply do the top up in terms of their risk management, link it to the right person that they have on record, and they can provide service to that individual. The other thing that we discovered too is that the federal program might be requiring some additional notification and consent that's relevant to the context of their program. So they may be asking for consent on some other pieces of information or some uses of it that pertains to their program only. It's not related to the generic use of the trusted digital identity. It's for the specific context of their program. So this is just another picture to show the trusted processes that we are assessing with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. The trusted processes that you see in green with the checkbox or the unmarked checkbox, those are the trusted processes that we're taking a very close look at. We've actually defined a whole set of conformance criteria related to each of these processes, which we work through and do the analysis and do the assessment. And again, you'll see with Trusted Digital Identity Provider, they do mapping to some of these higher order processes. They do identity creation, which is really identity resolution, identity establishment. In this case here, they're doing the credential management stuff, the credential creation, credential authentication. They do have an identity registration process where they do the identity validation, identity maintenance, etc. And then they have the notification and consent. So the key thing here is that rather than just having like 3 or 4 high-level processes that are kind of defined fuzzily, we've really hammered out the atomic processes with some very specific and unequivocal conformance criteria, so we can actually look at what a program is doing in a jurisdiction, see how they've modeled their business processes, and basically build it up from those 24 Lego blocks that we've defined. This is an example of a relying party that is not using a trusted digital identity. We just want to contrast that a little bit later on when they're using a trusted digital identity. But we discovered a relying party or a service provider, if they have to do their own registration process, their own identity proofing process, they have to do all of these processes, processes themselves. And you know, these processes are expensive. They're hard to do. They inconvenience the client, but nonetheless, if you're in the business of any type of high-value identity-dependent service, you have to do these things or be accountable for the trusted process outputs and the risks associated with it. So this next slide basically shows that very same relying party. I'm just flipping back and forth, that if a relying party is actually using or consuming a trusted digital identity, there's a whole bunch of things that they no longer have to do. And as you see those disappearing processes, they no longer have to do those things. And what that translates into is a very much more streamlined service for the client, because they no longer have to identity proof themselves. They no longer have to go through a tedious verification process. And because that relying party is relying on the trusted digital identity coming in from another jurisdiction, they can put them on the fast path into their program. Again, depending on the service, they may have to ask them some additional questions regarding notification and consent, for example. They will have to do the identity linking, actually associating the identifier from the trusted digital identity to the identifier that they have on record to make sure it's the same person. They may need to do some additional identity confirmation, but what we discovered is that these can be very light touch processes because the heavy lifting has already been done by the trusted digital identity provider. And then coming back to that idea of trusted processes versus conveyance, when we did the analysis, it became very clear to us that the trusted processes or outputs, or the trusted process outputs or the proofs, are actually independent of the conveyance model. And the proofs or the output states can be conveyed via traditional centralized model, such as a trusted third party, a federated identity provider, for example, or it can be done with a decentralized model, a distributed ledger, blockchain, or both. And really, what we discovered in the dotted line here is that there's lots of options that can coexist, they can compete, they can substitute each other for conveying those proofs. So if we have confidence in an output, say from a trusted process, it could go through a trusted third party, it can become an input state into another trusted process. And what we showed here in this diagram, that the output state of another trusted process might feed back into the system and actually be like an overall virtuous loop. Looking at it from a decentralized model, we found that the conveyance of proofs is no different. And so at the end of the day, with the trust framework, we can actually position ourselves to accept, as I said, traditional federated identity providers. That could be SAML, OpenID Connect. It could be token service provider platforms. It could be distributed ledger blockchain platforms that actually provides the conveyance for the proofs. Of course, we need to know that those proofs are going through, and there's security and privacy, etc. There is hope or optimism that the distributed ledger blockchain schemes can actually do that wholly with cryptographic approaches. With centralized or trusted third-party systems, you still need to have some trust in the providers. And but the thing is here is that we can actually entertain these different options within the framework that we've developed. As I said earlier, we're looking at vectors of trust. This is just another way of actually formalizing in a more detailed specification what you're prepared to trust. And it is a proposed IETF standard. The RFC came out in October, and currently the standard consists of 4 components around identity proofing, primary credential usage, primary credential management, and assertion presentation, which is really conveyance. So we're looking at this and finding that it will be very promising to communicate requirements for trusted processes, and also getting the outputs of those trusted processes back. So the key thing here is that it makes it becomes more granular or more compartmentalized than traditional levels of trust, levels of assurance, and it gives us an ability to be very specific on what we are prepared to trust from trusted digital identity providers. We might discover that it might be overkill, but there's no reason why we can't actually come up with some high-level vectors like proofing for government, or proofing for commercial, or proofing for international. We can settle on what trusted processes that we need to put into those vectors, and decide what the conformance criteria are. So a lot of possibility there, a lot of complexity, but we see that there is a lot of potential. Just a couple of more technical diagrams here, and again, we're trying to come up with a very simple and yet formalized model. Again, this is just showing the entity relationships. Right now we have relationships between persons and organizations. The first diagram, the top diagram, is the fully normalized diagram. But what we discovered that we needed to introduce an associative entity, namely a relationship, because what we're discovering is that relationships actually have states, and in and of themselves a relationship needs to be a trusted digital representation. Coming back to that notion of a trusted digital representation, is there may be some rights, duties, and obligations related to that. For example, a guardian, a parent, a officer of a company. So we have to model it as an object in and of itself. So that's it. I put my Twitter handle up here. The easiest way to contact me, if you want to contact me directly, is through my Twitter handle at @trbauma. We also have material that's going up on GitHub. This is the link here. It's on the canada.ca GitHub repository. There's a few other repositories up there, and so there's the link. And I'm just going to go back to the video here so you can see me. So that gives you an idea what we're working on. Again, this is all for discussion. I just want to qualify that this is not an official position of the Government of Canada. This is for discussion. We hope to get your feedback and get your input, and to develop a product that we can really apply in a very complex environment for trusted digital identity. We're pretty excited about what we're developing here. We're really leveraging all the good work that's been done over the years, the decades, and we're really trying to crystallize a simple and straightforward tool so we can actually assess and trust digital identities. So with that, thank you for watching this webinar, and hope to talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.